Very welcome to the Irish Political Roundup with me, Paul Brophy. We're joined today by Tom Healy, who is contesting the next general election, whatever that may be. Could be sooner than we think. Um, in Carlow Kilkenny as an independent candidate. I'm flying solo again. Um, my colleague Roisin the cleric is not with us here today, but she's very much in the background working very, very hard to help us put out the best possible content we can here on the Irish Political Roundup. Tom Healy was born in Dublin originally, and he moved to Kilkenny 2 years ago. Tom has worked for many years with many different government departments and agencies as an economist, and retired only a short while ago. Before retiring, Tom was a director of the Nevin Institute, which is a union supported think tank. And now Tom has decided to throw his hat in the ring and contest the general election in Carlow Kilkenny, whenever that may be, as an independent. So, Tom, you're very welcome to the Irish Political Roundup.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, Tom, we've chatted before about a range of different things, and I suppose I was just looking at your literature and your leaflet there, and one of the first things that struck out to me is that you would declare a housing emergency. How would you assess the current government's record uh, on housing? They will say that they've the number of houses that are being built has increased, the number of planning permissions has increased, the number of first-time buyers has increased. So they will say that they've made progress, but I'm sure you'd beg to differ.
Well, they've made progress. They are making progress, certainly compared to the situation, say, 10 or 15 years ago. But it's much too slow. I think that's the point. And the assessment of housing need, which has been reported by many organizations, including famously the Housing Commission recently, they published their report earlier this year. They showed that the needs of the demand for housing is enormous, partly because of a backlog of demand arising from the crisis, especially after 2008, but also the demographics. The population is increasing. There are specific reasons why people want to live in very often on the commuter belt into a bigger city or town. So all of that is putting huge pressure, and I estimate that the rate of house building is probably about half of what it needs to be. And even then, it's a question of making progress by degrees over a 10 to 15-year period to clear some of the backlog. So I think all in all, the government record, not just the current government, but successive governments actually, has been well below what it needs to be. And it does go back a long way to the 1980s, in fact, when there was a big change in the way the housing market was organized, with the gradual reduction in public housing through the local authorities. And that had a cumulative effect over a period of about 20 years in terms of directing people towards the private rental market or towards home ownership. That worked to a limited extent until the economic crash of 2008 onwards. And then public, shall we say, social housing more or less stopped for a few years and only recovered very, very slowly. So what we're seeing now is a catch-up, but it's still very ponderous, very slow. There are obstacles, financial, also in terms of the skilled labor that's required, but then the planning laws and the
Yeah,
administrative machinery is much too slow. Yeah.
yeah, you made an interesting point there. Um, there's a general accepted figure amongst the political parties and some independents that we need to be building about 50 to 52,000 houses a year over the next 10 years just to stand still.
Yeah.
Now, those houses don't build themselves,
Mm.
as you know. Do we have enough skilled workers to build those houses, Tom?
Probably not right now at the moment. To be honest, there is definitely a shortage of skills in construction, but that's also true in many other sectors of the economy. We are more or less at what people call full employment. I don't quite like the term because it overlooks many areas of underemployment and frictional unemployment. But taking that term on its face value, certainly the labour market is very tight, and construction is certainly is facing considerable difficulty there. Of course, we're all aware that many skilled workers went abroad back in 2012, around that time, and it's obviously very difficult to bring them back. And paradoxically, it's difficult for them to come back because it's difficult to get a house, isn't it? And so there's a sort of a catch-22 there. Yeah.
Exactly, and it was actually watching a clip there online there a while back, and it said at the time of the crash in 2008, a lot of guys who would have been electricians or carpenters, whatever, say tech electricians, for example, they would have
Mm,
went off
mm,
and went back to college and studied to be electrical engineers. So
mm,
they are the people that we really need to help build these houses,
mm.
and now they're kind
Yes.
of working in a kind of an
Mm.
administration role. So I suppose that's another side of the
Yes.
coin that
Yeah.
we don't look at as regards um getting the skilled people that we need to
Yes.
build
Yeah.
these houses. But you said you're also in favor of a referendum on housing. How would that increase the level of delivery of be it private or public housing?
Of itself, it doesn't necessarily increase the supply of housing, but I think it would be an important moral victory, I think, for the right to housing, and it would bring a better balance to the Constitution in terms of rights and responsibilities. We're familiar with the right to private property, and that's fine as far as it goes. But it seems to me that the right to private property in the Constitution has been interpreted in a very conservative and restrictive way, and it can be an obstacle in some cases to measures that are necessary in an emergency. And I believe that we are in an emergency situation. It does require exceptional measures. Now, that implicates land holdings, complex area, obviously, but also the importance of putting extra legal and moral pressure on government to deliver on housing. In my view, there should be a dedicated public agency or construction company set up, funded from capital that's held by the state in the Strategic Investment Fund, working with the local authorities, and they should be given tough targets every year to deliver, to commence house buildings in each area. Instead, we're looking at a situation of a leisurely progress, I would call it, towards a gradual expansion in affordable and social housing at a rate that is well short of what it needs to be. And it seems to me that from a political perspective, that without wanting to oversimplify matters, that in many cases, a lot of the political parties are in effect aligned with the interests of homeowners, particularly homeowners who have paid off their mortgage and who may be watching the value of their property, and who may be quite nervous about the proposals coming from, for example, Sinn Féin or other political parties. So there is that kind of social division, that you have a younger generation, also people on low income, who in many ways are shut out from owning a home, and in some cases are dependent on long-term private rental, which is very expensive. And in many cases, politically, I guess many of them gravitated towards Sinn Féin in the last 5 to 10 years, especially, and now seem to have drifted away from them again. And some maybe not so keen on voting, some are voting for various types of independence. But there is that kind of political divide. I don't want to oversimplify matters, but it is almost a story of the haves and the have-nots. And I think as we go into a general election, it's hard to believe actually that, whatever government is in power, obviously at the moment we know what we have. It's amazing that it's actually so popular, actually, when you
Mm.
think about it. And I think part of the reason for that too is that people don't see an alternative very often. But there is a factor as well that a lot of people are actually relatively comfortable. They've actually got a position in the housing market. They're owning their homes. They may be on pensions like me, yeah, on a pension. And there is that sense that yeah, we should deal with housing, but there isn't the urgency, the emergency that needs to be there. And I think we need to take a kind of a COVID emergency response here almost.
Yeah, exactly. And you mentioned affordable housing, and I'm sure you look at any leaflet from any candidate in the last local elections, European elections, and this upcoming general election, they will all say they want to see more affordable housing.
Mm.
What does affordable housing mean to you? How would you define that? You know,
You'd have
because
to ask an
it's
economist.
a it's a very, it's not, you could ask seven different people the exact same question,
Seven
you'll get
different
seven different
responses.
answers.
Yes, yeah, and there is this kind of famous kind of it's almost like a cliche, the guard married to the nurse or whatever, and there's a presumption that somehow the average income is going to be around 100,000, and therefore an affordable home should be no more than maybe 250,000. Although in practice, here in Kilkenny, the figures quoted are much higher than that. In fact, when you go through the statistics on household income, average household income is more like 42,000 for a household, not for an individual earner. So we're a way off in terms of the ratio of house prices to incomes. Clearly, there's a need for schemes that enable people to get onto the property market. But I think ultimately, the solution here is supply. And I think if we expand the supply through all necessary means, both public and private, and through housing associations and through various ways, that ultimately that is the best way to bring down prices, or at least I should say to control the rate of increases in prices. Yeah. And then you get the ratio right between house prices and incomes. And I suppose historically that ratio really ought to be somewhere like 3 to 1, roughly, very roughly. But at the moment we're looking more like 10 to 1 in Dublin, and somewhat lower ratio outside the main cities. So that's clearly not sustainable in the long run, and it's
So if we were
introducing.
to put a if we were to put a hard figure on it, Tom, say someone wants a three-bedroom house, affordable house, what would that be
Well,
selling
it,
at?
it, it obviously depends on the income of the individual or couple buying the house, but it's difficult to build anything new now for much less than 300,000 euro. Sometimes much more, depends on the type of house. And in the second-hand housing market, prices vary enormously. Again, depending on whether you're talking about a one-bedroom apartment or a three-bedroom semi. But you're looking at figures somewhere in the range of 2 to 300,000, sometimes more, closer you get to bigger cities. Now, what's affordable really all depends on someone's income, but there aren't that many households with more than 100,000 euro annual income between two earners. They certainly wouldn't be in the majority, put it that way. So there is a gap there, and I think that that has to be recognized. And I don't think there's any one single figure that defines affordability. I think it very much depends on as I said, the makeup of the household, and also what access they may have to funding, to loans. And it was the case historically that people had access to very low interest rate mortgages from local authorities. That's still the case. It's not so widespread as it used to be. And that gave people, again, the option of owning their own homes and sometimes paying back the mortgage over literally 40 years.
Yeah, exactly. And he spoke about a generation that are locked out of the housing market, either to rent, to buy, or yeah, to rent or to buy.
Mm.
What would your message be to those people?
Well, I think the only answer is to increase supply. It's a difficult message because people are looking very often for short-term fixes, help to buy schemes. I'm not generally in favor of them. I think they should be phased out, actually. And we should put the money and the effort into expanding supply, doubling the rate of house completions. that will take time. It can't be done immediately next year, but it needs to become a driving target for government. And of course, the other aspect of it is conversion of existing buildings. There is scope certainly for converting empty property, and we can see a lot of empty property. Some of it is not habitable, and it would need quite a bit of conversion work. But some of it would be, over shops, for example, or houses for one reason or another who are just left vacant. You can see that quite a lot actually when you're out canvassing, as I am at the moment in Kilkenny and Carlow. A lot of houses that are just lying empty.
Would
Yeah.
you say that vacant homes tax that's there is quite inefficient? It doesn't.
It's probably not high enough to do the job,
It's not
and
big enough stake.
yeah, I think so. Yeah, that is definitely the case. And now, obviously, there are reasons in every particular case why homes are left vacant. There may be complications to do with somebody going into long-term nursing care. There may be complications to do with probate and other legal issues. But I think in general, certainly in the case where people might be using property for speculative reasons, then I think there should be a very punitive tax, yes. And that
And at the
applies also, I think, on land, vacant land as well, which is very much related to housing.
and at the moment, am I correct in saying that that tax is applied and collected by the local authority? Wouldn't it be much better if it was collected by the revenue, because that's one institution that no one wants to get on the wrong side of?
True.
Yeah,
Yes. However, I'm of the view that over the last, say, 40 years since the late 1970s, the revenue stream into local authorities, whether through rates or other income sources, has been decreasing as a proportion of their total spend. And I think local authorities themselves raise about 5 billion euro a year through basically through local property tax and through the commercial rates. Now, I think actually there's a good argument for increasing that actually, and for local government to be less reliant on central government, but also to give local authority the means and the responsibility to deliver services. I think there's too much centralization of financing and decision making in the Customs House, in central government. Now, that runs contrary to what has been happening over the last 4 to 5 decades. And, the various changes that occurred in local government in the last 10 or 15 years just copper fastened the trend towards centralization. And it's my impression that obviously there are arguments as well against giving too much power to local government because of difficulties in the past and possibilities of shall I say, distorted decision making. But I do think in the main, the case for decentralization is compelling. And I think
yeah,
follow the money and you follow the decision making,
yeah, and that might tie in nicely to the next point there. You can see in the background there, you have a picture of lovely picturesque Goresbridge. Excuse me, I kind of what's that, clack up my tongue there a little bit. For our viewers out there who mightn't be fully aware, it's kind of Goresbridge. It's not too far away from Carlow as well, so it's kind of right on the
Yeah.
right at the sweet spot
Mm.
of the constituency of Carlow and Kilkenny. You moved to Goresbridge 2 years ago. Um, how would you see rural Ireland from your experiences on the canvas trail so far?
Yes, it's a community, and not just speaking about Goresbridge, but practically all other rural areas in counties Carlow and Kilkenny. It's a community under pressure demographically and economically. I mean, let's take Goresbridge as an example, but this has application right across the counties. A lot of employment used to be local, whether in agriculture or in an enterprise such as Red Mills. Now it's completely different. Workers are coming in from right across the southeast of Ireland, and the population in many areas is aging, and you see the decline in local businesses, closure of pubs, closure of retail. Recently, the only supermarket in Paulstown closed well, apart from Applegreen, that is, but the Spar shop closed in Paulstown, and Paulstown is quite a well-populated area,
Yeah,
certainly
yeah, it
as
would
in
be.
my,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah. And so there's a lot of pressure demographically and otherwise. We see as well a pattern of declining enrollment in primary school, in primary level, in many areas, and that's having implications in terms of fall in staff numbers ultimately, because the appointment of teachers depends on enrollment. So I think there's quite a threat there. Obviously, many people are concerned about the way that planning interacts with community development, and it does seem that the emphasis in national planning guidelines is on cluster developments and city or large significant towns developing. Now, there is an economic argument for centralizing services and housing, but as against that, I think there is a unique rural character to a community such as this, and I mean, there are some wonderful communities in right across the county: Graignamanagh, Callan, and Mooncoin. All of these communities have a rich history and a wonderful level of community engagement. I think it would be, in my view, the single most important requirement there is to enable people to move in and settle down there, families, younger people, to bring new blood into a community, to diversify the population a bit in terms of age and employment experience. Also to enable people to travel and move around more easily. Transport is an issue. I mean, by and large, the roads have improved. The main roads, I should say, and the motorways, that's opened up in many ways the southeast more than ever before. But it's still very difficult. You know, one is completely car dependent once you're off a main transport route. Even if you're living somewhere like Castlecomer, for example, the frequency of bus services into Kilkenny and up to Athy is quite limited, very limited actually. So that creates its own pressures and challenges. But I think housing, again, you know, it comes back to housing, and of course access to healthcare. You know, the importance of people having access to timely health services, to primary healthcare. There are some really good facilities being constructed in different places. Thomastown, there are plans to do so in Graignamanagh. I think we need a lot of that to take the pressure off acute hospital services, and to create a greater possibility for people to access services in their local community, if at all possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will be touching on healthcare in just a few moments. I suppose
Sure.
another industry within rural Ireland, which is very, very important still, is agriculture and farming. And farmers, they're having a little bit of a tough time of it at the moment.
Yeah.
Through you look at the whole thing with the nitrate derogation and
Yeah.
that and that's impact. Particularly dairy farmers are pretty adversely impacted. And then I know there's certain environmental targets that the country needs to hit and stuff like that. When we
Mm.
talk
Mm.
a just transition, what exactly does that mean?
Yes, I think farming is something that it's not just an industry or a business. It's interwoven with families, with the whole fabric
Mm,
of a community life. And the difficulty with top-down targets and directives is that it doesn't take due regard to the actual reality, the lived reality and experience of people. Having said that, I think we don't have much option, it seems to me, on the nitrates directive. I think that our derogation, I should say, I think that is something that's going to have to progress. But I do believe that there needs to be much stronger income support for farmers. And the last few years have been extremely difficult with the rise in input costs, and then the restriction on income and revenue from various sources. So the farmers have been squeezed on both sides. Costs and revenue have really squeezed their net income. And that's something that needs to be recognized, to the extent that what people call the just transition to a more sustainable model of farming, to the extent that we make progress there have to be equilibrating, compensating measures that support the income of farmers. Now, we're in a very different space economically to where we were 10 or 15 years ago. And I think we should be using some of the surplus funds to invest in sustainable energy, to invest in measures that could make that just transition much easier for people, particularly sectors that are unduly impacted by environmental and agriculture certainly is one of them.
So you'll be talking about making measures, make it easier for farmers to put solar panels on roofs and anaerobic
That's right.
digestion
Yes. Yeah,
and
absolutely.
various other different ways
Yeah, and financial.
to diversify their
Yeah.
income as well. And one subject that we've spoken a lot here on the Irish Political Roundup, we talk about food production.
Mm,
Ireland, we produce some of the best food in the world. So
yes.
99% of it is exported. So there's only about
Yeah.
1% staying in the country. Even if we
Mm,
take very simple like spring onions or scallions, or
yeah.
all viewers, as we're called scallion eaters, 85% of scallions that come into this country they're coming from Mexico. Now we have
Yeah.
the climate. I'm just taking scallions as an example now.
Mm,
We have the
mm,
climate to grow scallions,
yes. Yeah.
very, very efficiently. Um, Surely we should be for our own kind of food security and for
Yes.
better
Yeah.
for the environment that we should be able to produce more for our own domestic market.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, arguably, we should be consuming less red meat. We should be importing less food actually because of the carbon footprint. It's not just about the cost of food, but the overall impact, in terms of uh, transporting fruit or vegetables from the other side of the world, just because it's not seasonal at the moment in Ireland. Yeah, I think there's also space, for communities and households to grow their own where possible. Not everyone has that option, but community allotments, I think, are a great idea. Just promoting a change in thinking and in mindset. We all assume that we have tomatoes all year round, but they only grow obviously at certain times of the year. And I think people should be enabled. I mean, you mentioned particular vegetables that do well at this time of the year or through the winter. It's not that difficult to grow Brussels sprouts, and
Mm.
they're in season more or less from now on until January at least. And these are kind of like, these are not huge measures, but they are important. And I think there is something to be said for diversifying and appreciating the importance of local produce, and efforts are there in terms of local farmer markets, and there are many local markets around the county, not as much as perhaps there used to be, but I think that's something that could be developed and encouraged, certainly. Yeah.
And definitely, I suppose supermarkets, um, they have a big role to play because if
Yeah.
they're purchasing produce like Brussels sprouts, for example,
Mm.
at a low cost rate to the person supplying it, that that's not going to be very sustainable for any farmer that's providing that. So
Yeah, it's
so
impossible.
should
Yeah.
more be
Yeah.
done to kind of
Mm.
to ban those type of practices.
Yeah, it's certainly certain supermarket chains are obviously undercutting farmers, and that's been a big concern for the farming community, and rightly so. And you can see that, yeah, for vegetables and milk especially, but also certain types of meat as well, that they're really undercutting. I mean, the extraordinary thing is that many cuts of meat now are much cheaper than fish, and it's
Yeah,
really become very
exactly.
obvious. Yeah.
Fisher and fisheries is another subject we've covered here
Mm.
on the political roundup.
Yeah.
Patrick Murphy's been on our program a number of times. He's CEO of the Ireland South and West
Mm.
Fishers
Mm.
producer, and it's absolutely staggering to find
Yeah.
out that 85% of fish caught in Irish waters is caught by
Yeah.
foreign boats. So they're selling it back to us at a premium.
Yeah.
So
Mm.
there's
Mm.
something radically wrong there.
Yeah, yeah, there's an imbalance certainly, and it's my impression that in the bargaining and trading that goes on at international and European level, Irish fisheries took a hit, and there was a sort of some element of quid pro quo there, and obviously big fishing trawlers and conglomerates are coming in and sweeping up, and some of the quotas have been not in the interest of Irish fishermen. Yeah.
You have situations where you have French trawlers coming into maybe Castletown Bear and they could
Mm,
be cleaning the place out, and then you have
yeah.
your local fisherman. He has to make sure, oh God, you know, put this
Yes.
back. So we'll be bringing in quota and stuff like that. Like that's, you know, a lot of that comes down from at European level, but should
Mm.
be more being done at national levels to support our fishermen.
They could, there could be, yeah, certainly. And it's again, like farming, it's tied in with communities and families. It's not just a question of economic costs and benefits viewed in a narrow way. And many communities particularly on the Western Seaboard, are intimately interwoven with fisheries, and certainly more could be done. There is a somewhat Dublin-centric view very often, and it doesn't see what actually is happening on the ground in those communities, and a sense as well of people being left behind. The options are difficult because, like so many other areas of economic activity, we're in the middle of a global trend, and being part of a single European market, and now also various bilateral trade agreements between the EU and other economic blocs. It's very difficult for us to punch very high, but certainly more could be done. I take the point. More could be done to promote the interests of fisheries in Ireland. Yeah.
Absolutely. And you spoke about health services there as well. You were talking about Greg Manor, which wouldn't be too far for you there in Goresbridge.
Yeah.
There's a new primary care centre going to be built
Mm.
there. In Thomastown, which wouldn't be a whole 100 miles away either. There's
Yes.
a new community nursing unit
Yes.
being built there on the
Yes.
grounds
Yeah. Yeah.
of St. Columbus. So
Yeah.
health, we spend a hell of a lot of money on our health service here in Ireland, but a lot of people feel we're not getting the return as regards the
Yeah.
services that can be provided.
There is some truth in that. I'm not so sure that we spend necessarily more per capita than other countries. I did look at this in some detail a few years ago when I was doing research on healthcare expenditure, and this is based on data around 2018, which is dated now, I know.
Mhm.
But my overall conclusion was that we were broadly in line with comparable small Northern European countries, is what I looked at. Now, I will admit, though, our population is relatively younger compared to, let's say, other Scandinavian countries or the Netherlands. So you would expect that we would not spend quite as much per capita as those countries. I think the reasons are complex. I think that the unique nature of Irish healthcare, it's a two-tier system. It has some extraordinary features whereby the state subsidizes private medicine in public hospitals. And there is an enormous resistance to change and reform. So I think that's kind of part of the story about why health expenditure is at the levels that it is. But I think we need to be mindful as well that looking to the future, there are a number of things going on. Population is increasing, roughly 11% between 2016 and 2022. The proportion of people over 65 is increasing all the time. And then the nature of healthcare is changing as well. It's becoming a lot more complex. So if someone presents with a stroke, for example,
Yeah,
in accident and emergency, the treatment they get, the procedures followed are very different to what they would have been 20 years ago. It's much better now, the treatment actually. But that it calls for intensive staff involvement, and all these treatments, also the treatment of cancer, which is much improved over the last 20 years. All of that
absolutely.
is
Yeah.
very costly. So I think there is a debate going on at the moment, of course, about pay and number strategy in the health sector, and it seems to me that the aspect of patient safety is being overlooked. We need to look at this in a much more holistic way. But I certainly don't deny that there are considerable inefficiencies in the health service. We see disproportionate amount of money spent on consultancy, for example, and on agency staff, quite a large amounts of money spent on agency staff, which makes little sense because it's filling, in many cases, vacancies and shortages because of restrictions on staff recruitment. So it's a complex case, health, and it's a very difficult one to reform. I suspect actually that there is, it's a little bit like housing, you know. I suspect that there's a resistance to reform from those who are relatively comfortable and who think that they benefit from the current arrangement. It's my view that they don't benefit as much as they think, actually. They pay dearly for private health insurance, and it doesn't necessarily get them the service that they think they need when they're very sick. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I was looking at your literature as well, and mental health was an area that was some was just one area that you wanted to particularly
Mm.
focus on. Of
It's
course,
it's a it's a
we're in
huge challenge.
October, and it's
Yeah,
we're filming
yeah,
today. It is World Mental Health Day, and October
yes,
is
yeah,
Health Month.
yeah. I honestly don't think that there is a family in Ireland that has not been touched directly or indirectly by mental health issues. And I think the first thing that we need to do as a society is openly acknowledge this issue, actually, and be prepared to talk about it. Probably the biggest obstacle to dealing with mental health issue is honest conversations, and people opening up about it. Obviously, things have improved in that regard. People are much more uh, inclined to talk about it in public than was the case in the past. I think also that the services is a big issue. Clearly, and you asked me about rural life. One of the issues, it's true of urban areas and rural areas. It may be, I don't know, it may be a little bit more an issue in rural areas is isolation and loneliness. The prevalence of mental health issues, particularly for men, sometimes younger men, sometimes older men. And all of this, I think, points to the need for frontline community services. Obviously, we want to keep people away from acute hospital settings, if at all possible. And the whole thrust of public policy over the last, say, 30 years in the area of mental health is to direct people into the community away from large resident institutional settings. And that's obviously very good and very understandable. But the problem, as I see it, is that the resourcing and funding of community health services leaves a lot to be desired. And it seems to me that access to a timely service to avail of the right professionals in the right place is missing. And it's often the case that public hospitals are picking up the pressure in A&E. They're not necessarily actually suitable, and the psychiatric services are not really in place, even in an acute hospital setting, to
So
actually deal with people who come in. I'm talking now about emergency presentations,
yeah,
but
and
the follow through afterwards is crucial as well. And it seems to me, based on what I've read but also personal observation, that there's excessive reliance on medication without therapy, without the necessary therapeutic interventions. And again, that comes back to resources, staffing in acute settings, mental health settings, and in the communities. Very often, it's not just that there's not enough staff, but also there's not enough experienced staff, and that's very crucial here as well. Actually, that there's an availability of experienced, trained therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists who can actually, make the difference in terms of giving people timely access.
and then there are other staff as well, other disciplines like speech and language therapists, occupational therapists.
Absolutely, yeah,
They may
yeah,
not always be there.
yeah,
So
yeah. Speech and language is
there's
such a
the
big
initial,
issue.
there's
Yeah,
the initial. the initial mental health treatment and then any additional supports there. So you're saying that those kind of ancillary supports that come with it
Yes.
are what they could be.
Yeah,
If
absolutely.
the staff shortage.
Yeah, and I want to kind of mention one point just before we move on from this, that there is a mental health bill going through the Dáil. It may not be, I'm pretty sure it won't be taken before the Dáil is dissolved. I might be wrong, but the Taoiseach has mentioned that he'd like to get this passed before the end of the current Dáil. I would have concerns about some aspects of that bill. I think that the difficult balance to be struck between individual autonomy and the rights of someone who is undergoing mental health challenges, uh, and on the other side, the safety of the patient. I'm talking here about the difficult clinical decisions that have to be made about involuntary status. And I think in the past, the balance was wrong. There was a gross violation of justice very often. People were incarcerated for years. I think there is a risk that actually we could go to the other extreme, actually. And I think the views of the specialists, the psychiatric specialists, should be listened to here, and not just the views of people promoting very justifiably and very understandably the rights of the individual, the mental health rights of people in this thing. I think there are many cases, where people with a mental health history will say, something, I'm glad that I received the help and services that I did at the time, even though I didn't want to be there. So I think
Yeah,
that balance needs to be got right. Yeah.
yeah. It is a balancing act between the proper medical support and
Mm,
a person's their rights as well as
mm,
a human being, which is so
yes.
important. And
Yeah.
something that's also very important as a human right as well is education. And
Mm,
from reading some of your literature as well, um, education around children with additional needs is an area that you feel that
mm.
you could be doing a lot more.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, my ears are a bit red, from listening to people on the doors in Carlow and Kilkenny. It's actually, in some cases, it's actually heartbreaking, to hear the stories of parents, of mothers, of fathers, whose children, and in some cases, we're talking about more than one child in a household, sometimes even more, 2 or 3 children, who have varying degrees of autism or ADHD or similar conditions, who are just getting no access to services. They've no access to assessment. In some cases, they scramble the money together to go through private assessment. And even then, they're left stranded. There's no proper services in the schools. And I mean, the lives that people have, it can be so difficult. I mean, it's just amazing to see it, and heartbreaking as well. Now, look, I think the people working in the services, I'm sure, are doing their best. But I do think actually we need to be more honest in admitting that this is far from what is really the rights of children. And I mean, we've heard recently Minister Eamon Ryan being very open about his own personal experience. The Taoiseach himself, his brother, has been involved in advocacy in this area, and he has said that he's very determined to improve the situation. But I think it's a question partly of money and resources, but also of organization and management. And we have too many services, we have too many agencies, all operating in silos and not talking to each other and not properly sharing information. There should be a single database where the child, where all the necessary information is accessible by the key professionals. And also there should be one stop shop, where a family can go for help. And instead of the current situation where, oh, that's nothing to do with me, you must go to the CAMS for that particular condition, and you go to CAMS and they say, no, 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 you go to another agency, and so
Yeah,
on and
yeah.
so on. And the parent is sent running from, from one place to another. All of that could be overhauled and changed. It's not just about money and resources and staffing.
And there's talks of um, your therapists maybe going back into schools, speech and language therapists would be one, occupational therapists that might be another. Do you think initiative like that would help the teachers who, they can only do so much, and obviously help
Yes, yeah.
the parents and the children, I
Yeah,
suppose, most
well,
important.
I mean, this is such an obvious one. I mean, we all know that the first 4 to 5 years of a child's life are crucial. And, when a child has needs, particularly in the area of speech and language, for example, um, this is a real gap in the current system. Actually, talking more broadly about special education, what I'm hearing about is the absence or the lack of occupational therapists and speech and language. Those are the two ones that are mentioned. And one of the issues there as well is that we're just simply not graduating enough OTs and speech and language graduates. And those that are graduated either go abroad or
Yeah,
in some cases
absolutely.
they go into private practice, and so it's a real problem, and it's not just in education; it's also relevant in the public hospitals as well. That there's a lack of OT input very often.
Yeah, and on education, it's been brought up online as well about the new SPHE curriculum. So that's the
Mm,
social, personal, and health education. There are teachers that have spoken out who are
mm,
very critical of the content within um, the um, the curriculum. Some are of the opinion that children or young teenagers are being sexualized at a very, very young age. Do you think this curriculum it hasn't taken, the concerns of teachers into account, and there are some teachers who
mm.
feel very, very uncomfortable with with teaching the
Yeah.
subject.
Well, I'm aware of the controversy. I must admit I haven't had the possibility of looking into it enough. There have been claims made about this and counterclaims, and the minister has vehemently denied some of the suggestions. I think certainly my impression is that parents, we're talking now about, children roughly in the 12 to 14, 15 age bracket. It seems to me that parents should be better informed, should be better engaged. Obviously, the whole issue of parental consent is crucial here. But I leave it at that. I think it's an issue that certainly comes up. I can't say that I've heard a lot about it on the doors, maybe only a few cases, but I think there's a there are many different issues that are challenging. I have a 12-point manifesto. I hadn't had the opportunity to go into this one too much, and I'm fighting battles on other fronts as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. And Tom, originally in 20, uh, this year, you were going to contest the local elections in the Castlecombe area
Mm,
for Ian. That didn't materialize for
mm,
one reason or another. Why have you decided now to run as an independent candidate?
mm. Very good question. I suppose my decision to get involved in politics goes back at this stage about a year and a bit. Um, I very much I think there was a wake-up call for me personally when a bill was passed through the Dáil, a second stage bill in in May of last year, which envisaged the legalization of abortion up to 24 weeks and even beyond that on more liberal grounds than is currently the case. And no, the legislation hasn't been finalized. Obviously, it's still somewhere in the system. There was a report from the Joint Health Committee, but that propelled me into political engagement. I had been involved in politics as a young man in the Labour Party, actually, way back in the day. And then, I didn't quite plan to get involved in politics. I was always interested in politics, and I wrote and researched a lot about political economy over the years. And I suppose my politics would be, for want of a better term, left of centre, and still are very much. But I joined into really primarily for that reason, not because politics needs to be a single issue. I don't think single issue politics works particularly well, but an important issue, at least important to me anyway, in combination with other economic and social policies, was the way forward. So I did that in good understanding and faith. Why I left really was to do with a difference of view on immigration. Now, I think I have to be fair here. Aintu didn't really address the issue of immigration that much, but it was very much highlighting, as it saw the problems of unregulated or excessive immigration, as they termed it. But that was very much, a kind of almost a marginal issue until about November of last year. And things came to a head in Ireland towards the end of last year. It was building up and brewing for a long time. And fast forward to the present time, the government parties, in particular Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, but also Sinn Féin, actually, to be quite honest, have shifted their position on immigration, and they have more or less aligned with where Aintu was, between its foundation in 2019 and 2023. The issue didn't concern me that much last year because there were other issues to be confronted, housing being one of them, and the ethics at the beginning of life and also the end of life. These are all important issues, human rights issues, in my view, actually.
Yeah.
But the immigration thing came to the fore in November, December onwards, and I felt that the way that immigration was being framed, it was being framed as a problem, and it was a question of a competition for scarce resources, and that Ireland is full or is getting full or moving towards fullness and wasn't able to accommodate particular categories of immigrants, particularly asylum seekers and perhaps Ukrainian refugees as well. I took a different view. Now, one might say, okay, was that enough reason to part company politically? I think it was in the circumstances last November, December, because things really came to a head on the streets of Dublin, as we know, and there have been quite a lot of ugly incidents on the streets and in various other places and towns and villages. I feel quite strongly that actually we need to find a way forward on immigration that welcomes people, but that plans and manages it better. And you might ask the question, well, isn't that what Aintu is saying? Well, Aintu has its own policy, and I don't want to overdwell on this point, but it has its own approach on deportations, for example. It's been publishing material in the last few weeks on this, updating its immigration policy, and I wouldn't share that by and large. Now, my own stance and position on immigration is outlined on my website, tomhealy.ie, so more of the detail is there. But I do think as well that we need to frame this debate very carefully, because we do risk creating divisions within Irish society. And there is an opportunity in the general election as well, in some ways, for people to misuse the issue of immigration to drive particular political agendas. So that actually, from a motivational point of view, along with the pro-life issue, is quite would be very much the main reasons actually why I'm involved here in running for election. And if I may say so, out of, I think there's about 15, 16 candidates at the moment in Carlow Kilkenny. on the
Yeah,
last count.
correct there, yeah.
There's been a few new. I think I can claim, Paul, that I'm actually quite unique because I'm the only candidate who's going on about issues of further liberalisation in abortion and euthanasia, and at the same time, I'm talking about housing as a right in the Constitution, and I'm leaning towards a pro-migrant position. I think politically, in the political space right now in Ireland, that's pretty unique actually, because
Mm.
a lot of people I come across who are exercised about some of these ethical issues that I've mentioned are not particularly necessarily on my page in terms of immigration. And a lot of people that I would agree with very strongly on immigration are almost scandalized by my position on abortion and euthanasia.
Yeah, yeah,
And,
yeah.
and yet we go into the general election and there's almost no discussion on these issues that I'm talking about, the beginning and the end of life. And no one wants to talk about it. It's all very awkward. And people may feel, well, you're a man, what do you know about this? And I take the point that a man cannot fully know the experience of a woman who goes through pregnancy and childbirth. By the way, that's one of the differences between men and women, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think,
Difference.
just because I might hold the wrong views, wrong in inverted commas, on pro-life, it doesn't mean that I don't have a right to express my views on this, So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And independents, they're in around 15, 16% in the polls. Um, what was I going to say? Yeah, obviously, do you think they'll play a role in formation of the next government?
I'd say quite likely, yes. I think between them, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael probably won't get a majority. Who knows? Who knows?
Mm.
You can't predict these things really, but there's a fair likelihood that Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael will look to some independence for support to form a government. It's probably unlikely to be the Greens. I can't see Labour coming back that strongly to make them a potential coalition partner. But if that's the way they go, that's the way they go. I think Labour did a lot of harm to itself actually in the last 15 years. I know they will argue that they had to do what they had to do. I'm not so sure that's really the case. They did a lot of harm. The Social Democrats seem to have overtaken Labour. They may do reasonably well, but I think the political landscape actually is remarkably stable in one way. We had something like 80% plus of, I think I'm right in saying this, county councillors returned in the last
Mm.
local elections. The situation in Kilkenny, Carlow is remarkably stable, actually, when you look at the local elections. And
Uh,
in the forthcoming general election, there probably aren't going to be any major disruptions in this part of the world anyway. So I think the independents certainly will have a role to play, and there will be a lot of horse trading if the major parties want their support. But I think for that reason, when people are voting for an independent, and I'm one of them, I think people ought to be very careful, actually. They
mm.
should really look at what people stand for. Have a look at my manifesto on my website and make a decision. Is this the sort of person I want to represent me? And this is what democracy is all about.
And Tom, we've only got a few minutes left. I'm just going to leave the floor open to you. You can
Hmm.
look down the camera and talk to the prospective voters here in Carlow Kilkenny. And I'll just say the floor is yours.
Thanks. Well, what I'd like to say is that this is a time and opportunity for change, and in this part of the country, you have before you someone who is prepared to work hard, who is engaged in the community, but also who brings quite considerable experience in terms of economics, in terms of engagement with public policy, in terms of knowledge of local and national and even international events and challenges as well. So I think this is an opportunity. I'm going to be answerable to you, the voter, and to my own conscience, not to party headquarters. And I think that's important. And I would strongly urge you to consider carefully all the various points in my manifesto. I'm sure there will be some issues and points that you will not agree with, perhaps, but I think you have to weigh up all the different considerations. And we have a wonderful system of preference voting in this country, and you don't necessarily have to give me your number one, but maybe a number two or a three or a four. Better still, a number one.
Yeah, well, Tom Healy, independent candidate here in Carlow Kilkenny. Thanks a million for taking the time to talk to us here on the
Thank
Irish
you.
Political Roundup. It was interesting to um, kind of have a look at some of the elements of your manifesto that you'll be uh, running on in the forthcoming general election, which we think will be quicker and sooner than we think. So I'd like to say a big thank you to all our viewers for taking the time to watch us here on the Irish Political Roundup. As always, like I say, a big thank you to my colleague Roisin Cleric, who's working very, very hard in the background. And if you like this video and other videos we have, please do subscribe, like, share. You know, there's something there for everyone. From me, Paul, here at Irish Political Roundup. Thank you, and have a great day.
Thank you. Goodbye.